Welcome to the very first episode of Gianna Volpe's Deep Dive, recorded and produced at LTV Studios. I'm Gianna Volpe, also host of Heart of the East End, recorded live Monday through Friday mornings on WLIWFM and replayed at midnight. Our first guest today is Prudence Carabine of the East Hampton Historical Farm Museum. Welcome, Prudence.
Thank you.
We're talking 375 years
We are.
of East Hampton town, and you are a 12th generation Bonnaker.
I am.
So take us back to the 17th century right here on the East End.
Well, as you probably heard somewhere along the way in your education, there were a bunch of people in England who kind of got annoyed with the different religious and political actions that were going on over there. And they decided sort of en masse to get on a boat and come to the new world and make a new life for themselves in a way that was more appealing to them. So they did, and they landed at Plymouth Rock and sort of settled the Boston, Massachusetts, Rhode Island area. And then there were a couple events that happened 15, 20 years later that made them rethink their staying in that area for whatever reason. And, the natives who they found there were not always friendly, and there was just as much control over some of the groups because of their religious issues and other things that they decided to get on a small boat and come to Long Island. They landed in Southampton, and then the same dimension of the same dynamics kind of hooked in after a few years, and they decided, some of them, 8 families, to get in another boat and come out to East Hampton, which was a day's rowing from Southampton. And my family, the Talmadges, among others, were in that boat. So we're talking about independent, free-spirited,
Brave.
very brave with their families, and very hopeful that they could start a whole new enterprise and country, really, on Long Island. And the gift that the Bonnakers discovered in the first few days was that the Gardner family, which had received Gardner's Island as a gift from the king, and the Gardners, of course, are still living on Gardner's Island after almost 400 years. The Gardners had come before the Bonnakers and made friendships with the Montaukett Indians. So when the Bonnakers arrived,
really important.
When the Bonnakers arrived, they didn't have slings and arrows thrown at them. They had people on shore greeting them, and then eventually teaching them how to take chopped up fish and to put it in a hole with a corn seed and grow corn and all the other things that they grew out here, and how fertilizer worked here on the soils, which soils were good, which soils weren't good. Of course, a lot was very sandy. And so Gardner had sort of done the diplomatic layer of, hello, we're not here to hurt you, we're here to work beside you, element that made the Southampton people envious, because in some ways the Southampton tribes were not as welcoming, and there were other tribes up the island, the Algonquin tribal groups, that were not as welcoming. But in East Hampton, the Montauketts were like, hey, sit down and have a pipe. And that's the way things more or less went for a long, long time. So we had a relationship with our neighbors that was convivial and productive. And so our development out here grew from the original 8 families very, very quickly. Again, it was isolated. We didn't have the trains, and the boats didn't arrive here regularly, and there was no, other transportation, no internet, none of that.
Later.
Right. And so we were isolated on the eastern end. And that was for the best as far as a lot of local people were concerned.
I did want to ask you about the springs, and I love this book. So is Ferris G. Talmadge one of your 3,200 cousins that you...
No, he's my grandpa.
Oh, this is Grandpa Ferris.
This is Grandpa Ferris.
Okay.
And he wrote this book about
The old
springs.
days.
And we have this at the Farm Museum for sale. It's $10. And that all goes, of course, to the Farm Museum. When people came out and the Talmadge family settled in Springs, in Willow Hill, still there. The house is on the corner of Old Stone Highway, heading to Louse Point. These are all names that are still known and loved.
And there's the thing that I wanted to ask about the springs is what has stayed the same and what has changed? Because although there is a lot that has changed, a lot of Springs still looks very much the way that it did.
Well, the Springs land and area, as defined by the ocean and the bay, is an area that is full of fishing history, full of farming history, but the fishing is really the mainstay. And Springs had always been the winter place for the Montaukets to winter over because they could always get shellfish in Springs. They didn't have to go out on the water in heavy seas and get whales or other large fish. They could get the shellfish around the Springs Bayside. So the Montaukets were always there. So they and the early Bonnickers set up these connections with each other as per the Gardner Island need was, because gardeners were very wonderful in their diplomacy, but they expected people to get in rowboats and row over and manage and work the island too. So there was a double-edged, I won't say sword, but a double-edged agreement that, we will help you guys, but you have to come over and help us on Gardner's Island, which actually employed between 30 and 60 people annually over there to maintain the island, because it was a self-sufficient island with a windmill, a fire department, medical care, and huge fields and gardens, and several houses, of course, cattle, pigs, horses, which makes it spectacular today, too, of course, but it's private today. It always was. But in any case, there was a helping hand reached out to gardeners from gardeners back. So the three elements, gardeners, the Montaukets, and the Bonnickers, had really what my grandfather called heaven on earth. Because of the bay side, we were warmer in the winter. We didn't have the hellacious snow and ice that some other parts of the islands had. We could always get shellfish. There were always ways of keeping your animals in fodder and feed. There were always ways of, reaching the other parts of Long Island easier through the boats. And the one thing that Springs had then was a feeling that everything is in Springs. I don't need to leave Springs.
Right.
My grandfather was one of 7 people who got on a horse after 8th grade and rode into East Hampton to go to high school. And 7 people in the town of East Hampton graduated high school in 1914. It was not the thing to do. The thing to do was to work. If you went through 8th grade, you worked.
Right.
And maybe you read for the rest of your lives, and maybe you wrote beautiful penmanship and great letters, but you didn't require any further education.
Why was that? Why did Ferris want to go to school and go to...
My grandfather played baseball, and he was a pitcher. They called him Rabbit. And he was also a runner. And I believe, or I know for a fact, that the Bonnickers played Maidstone Club and beat them a lot in baseball at the club, sometimes at Herrick Park, which was set up for baseball early in the 20th century, 1905, I think. But Maidstone Club had a member who was the president of Syracuse University, which is which is a very old school. And he said, "Hey, Rabbit, you want to go to college?" And my grandfather said, "Well, my dad is a truck farmer and goes out on a fishing boat when he has to raise cash for the taxes, throws up every time he gets in bad weather on the boat, doesn't like fishing, but this is how you get cash. Everything else is barter." And the guy said, "Don't worry about it. We'll pay your way.
Wow.
You can pitch." So my grandfather, after he graduated high school, knew that he was going to Syracuse University, along with his cousin, George Sid Miller, who graduated the same year, who went to Cornell. Both of them got degrees in agricultural, basically master farmer. And of course, along the way, they both were offered all kinds of other jobs in all kinds of other places. But my grandfather hooked up politically through his friends at Syracuse, continued to play ball, and came out to Long Island and decided that Long Island farming needed to produce better potatoes, more crop, more everything after World War I, and hooked up with Cornell Extension. And there was sort of a symbiotic relationship between the universities and these two men, George Sid Miller and my grandfather, who said, there's a better way to make agriculture work for us here. Now, of course, what they didn't know at the time was that Cornell was pushing a whole bunch of heavy metals to slather on the soil. And there will be some people listening to this who will be upset, but we ended up with a cancer cluster.
Well, you think about like DDT and all of the, the history of pesticides and farming, and you'll hear that story over and over again. I'm curious, speaking of symbiosis and about, I'm thinking about using the chopped up fish as fertilizer. One of my questions for you is, who are the bubs, and how have the bubs and the farmers helped each other? Wait, can a farmer be a bub, or is that?
Oh, yeah.
All right, so who are the bubs?
Well, the bubs are the ones who have been here for generations. And
that work in
the field or work on fishing.
Right.
Now, the bubs in the 80s, of course, got their legs cut out from underneath them because of the new striped bass law that appealed to the commercial fishermen and the surf casters. Hole seining was a style of fishing that had gone on for 300 years, and it wasn't a job. It was a lifestyle, because you got up very early in the morning, as in like 3, 4 o'clock, went out on the water, got the fish in your net from the boat, hauled the net in on shore, and you were back in your home by 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
And this was a practice that went on
since the 17th century.
And then one day, everything changed.
Billy Joel tried his best to stop this. He worked with the people who were going to be at our next lecture, at a lecture's too fancy a word, chat, with Mary Vorpal, who is the widow of one of the fishermen, and Arnold Leo, who hooked up with Billy Joel during the 80s and proceeded to go to Albany and say, you cannot take this lifestyle away from these hundreds of men and women who know no other way to make a living.
I remember speaking to Mr. Bennett about this.
And they said, basically, yes, we can, watch us. So after that unsuccessful meeting in Albany, Billy Joel took Arnold Leo to D.C., and they got told, we're sorry, but all the legislators in New York State are being encouraged to take this away from these tiny little group of people on Eastern Long Island, because who cares about them anyway?
So and this is just one example in a line of many. Most recently, you have a big to do about privatizing beaches. Can you talk about Truck Beach and what's going on there?
Well, all of the Bonnickers, including myself, we all grew up thinking that the beaches belonged to all of us because of something called the Duncan patent, which my grandpa brought down from Syracuse in 1925 and handed to Stuart Vorpal in 1965 when Stuart was 28 and I was 18, helping my grandpa write this book. And my grandfather, who was blind at that point because of glaucoma and diabetes, told Stuart Vorpal to hammer the trustees. Stuart was a trustee. Hammer the trustees on the head with this and then go to the town board and start on them. The Duncan patent had given the water up to the tide line to the trustees to manage, and that area, as well as the sea, belonged to anybody who lived there as a whole, which is a representation of what the Montaukets believed about land. The Montaukets did not believe that if you give me $50, I'll give you a piece of land. The Montaukets did not believe that you could buy land or oxygen or the sea.
And nowadays, my gosh, you have to give someone millions to...
So we all grew up thinking we can take our pickups down to the beach and have beach parties and basically do whatever young people with their families do on the beach until all hours of the night. And if you start taking that away from us, you are taking away what the Duncan patent, which from the King of England, who said, "Thou shalt not take the water up to the waterline, the beach up to the waterline, from anybody. It belongs to the town as a whole." Well, during the 1880s, the trustees sadly missed a step. And I don't know if it was financial or they got pushed into something, but they traded a piece of the beach for cash in the Amagansett area.
I'm thinking, and this is a story you hear with the Native people over and over again.
Now, the trustees may have been as ignorant and as believing of the situation as the Montaukets were about what happened in Montauk. I don't know. I wasn't there. It was 1880. I wasn't there. But I know that when somebody says, "Oh, yes, you can still walk on the beaches and you can still do whatever you want on the beaches," we're not going to stop you from doing that. Well, of course, in the 21st century, they built fences.
Right.
And that means you can't take your truck on the beach in that area. And that kind of was like the nail in the coffin for a lot of local people, like, you're taking away our beach rights. So now it's in court. It's been in court for years and years.
But it exacerbates that tension between the way things used to be and the way they are quickly becoming, the ability for people to stay and live and work the way that they have for centuries.
See, the dollar is a very significant piece of paper to many, many, many of our new friends. The dollar wasn't always in practical use out here because we were a barter.
Since bartering is
we were a barter economy, and people understood the value. I have a cousin who took 12 Jackson Pollocks and still has them in payment for work that he did around the Pollock estate. And, when I talk to him about those Jackson Pollocks and make sure he's insured them, which he has, he says, "You don't understand, Prue. They're not money to me. Each of those represents a time when I worked with Jackson to accomplish a certain thing that he wanted done on his property. And that was all that meant to me. These are my life works. Has nothing to do with dollars." Now, this is a concept, of course, that people out there will say, "My God, is she ignorant? Does she not understand?" Of course I understand. I'm here to tell you I'm worth almost $10 million.
I believe it.
Because I come from a farming family. And the farmers cried all the way to the bank.
Right.
The fishermen had nothing. So a lot of them left, and a lot of them, as we'll hear at this symposium, their lives were ruined. Their family lives were ruined because of the things that happen when people lose their way of life. Bad things happen. You don't always just jump into a job at the grocery store. So what you're trying to do, I so support, because we all understand that cultures die. But this culture was an experiment that started 375 years ago.
Older than our country.
And is still going on. And the people who landed here and in Massachusetts and Rhode Island went forth out into this country with the same perception of how one treats another. That we are all just walking each other home. And that the dollar is something we use when necessary. But the element of caring about each other and fostering other people's hopes and dreams is an impression that has made this country the place to go to all over the world. And I know that because I've been in a lot of wonderful countries, and they all ask me how they can get to America. When you talk to people who are working people, how can I get to America? And it's not because of the dollars. It's because of the attitude that has built this country and made it great. And I'm sorry, but I believe that those early settlers whose, there are 38 towns called Talmadge all over this country. There are almost 120 called Hamilton. Hello, you don't call a town after an idiot or somebody who has no purpose in life. You call the town that you have started way out in the prairies by somebody you admire and somebody who you trust.
Speaking of which, in these last few seconds, where can people go to find out more information about the East Hampton Historical Farm Museum and celebrate the Banneker way of life?
Thank you. We are open every Saturday from 10 to 4. And we have news releases, as we're doing next week at Guildhall, to film these two ladies, lady and gentleman in their 80s, who are going to explain, there was a movie made about the end of the Hall Signers called Men's Lives, Peter Matheson, and that's a romanticization. We're now 40 years out, and a lot of people are no longer romantic about that, the end of the Hall signing.
Well, everyone, I am so grateful that you tuned in for the very first episode of Gianna Volpe's Deep Dive, recorded and produced at LTV Studios. Thank you so much. We'll be back.